everyone, this is Stephanie from the Pasadena Public Library. Today I will be sharing with you a tutorial on how to sew a fitted face mask. Links to the written pattern instructions as well as the printable pattern can be found in the description below. The pattern I'm using today is a free pattern. It's from the Big Community Sew website. I think it's a really great fitting pattern that seems to fit a variety of face size as well. And it has different options for how to create your ties or ear loops. So to start off, I'm going to show you how the finished mask looks. I really like how you can bunch up the fabric on the sides of the mask to adjust the size of your face. So this is my fabric that I'm going to be using to make the exterior of the mask. It's just a good quality quilting cotton. I purchased, I think this is half a yard, but you only need about a quarter of a yard to make the mask. So here's my pattern piece. This is the outer layer piece, so I'm going to place it right here. And when it says cut one pair, that means mirrored. So that's why I've folded my fabric in half here. And be careful when you're folding your fabric in half. If it has a direction like my print does, so these cats, I don't want them to be upside down. So that's why I've folded it this way instead of folding it down like this, because then one side of my mask would end up upside down. So I'm just going to line up this grain line mark with the direction of the grain line on my fabric. So you can pin it in place just like this. Alternatively, you could place some pattern weights on top of this and cut it out with a rotary cutter. But I'm going to assume that you don't have that and we're just going to cut it out with scissors. Okay, so that's my outer layer that's cut out. I also need to cut out my lining. You could use the same fabric for your lining. I'm going to use a different one though so that you can see the difference. Okay, I'm going to cut this out, but this time I'm going to use the rotary cutter to show you what that looks like. So what I'm going to do is cut out my fabric strips. It needs to be 1.5 inches wide, and then in total it needs to be about 1.5 yards long. So since I have half a yard here, I'm going to piece it together. I'm going to cut out 3 strips that are 18 inches long by 1.5 inches wide. And if you don't have a rotary cutter to do this, you can just mark it with some chalk or pencil and a ruler and then cut it out with scissors. So this step is optional. You could also use elastic or ribbon or pre-made bias tape, but I really like the look of the matching fabric ties. So we have everything all cut out. The first step is going to be taking our 2 exterior pieces and placing them right sides together. And we want to line up this curved edge and pin it together. And I'm going to do the same thing with the lining. So this pattern calls for 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is equivalent to 1 centimeter. So on my machine, I have a little 3/8 mark, or a 10, meaning 10 millimeters. So I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with this mark right here, which is the first line to the right of my presser foot. And I'm just going to stitch along the curved edge. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and also at the end. If you have trouble at any point, you can always use your hand wheel and make sure that the needle is down piercing the fabric. Then pick up your presser foot and pivot your fabric as needed. So now I have both of my pieces stitched. The next thing I'm going to do is cut some little snips into the seam allowance along this curved edge on both pieces. So basically this is just some V's like this. Be careful not to cut through your stitching, but this will help the seam lay flat once we open it up. And I'm going to do the same thing with my lining. So now I'm going to come in here and press this seam allowance open. Just take your time. Just go one little segment at a time and press it. And if you really have trouble doing this step, you can also just press the seam allowance to the left side. Yeah, it's always a little bit tricky to press a curved seam like this, but it is really important to do this step. Then I like to just come in here and you see these little tails that are coming off the end. I like to just snip that off so I get a really clean edge. The next thing I'm going to do with both my pieces is an optional step, but I like the way it looks. So I'm going to top stitch along both sides here along this seam, about 1/8 of an inch away from the center seam. So if you're not too confident with your top stitching skills, you can skip this step. As you place it down, you just want to make sure that your seam allowance is still pressed open. And every now and then, I just pull up on my fabric and make sure that my seam allowance is still pressed open. And I'm very gently just pulling this apart. It can be kind of tricky because it is a curved edge here. So that's what that looks like. I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing on the left side now. So I'm just gonna turn it upside down. Just take your time, go nice and slow. And then you can see it is top stitch on both sides. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the lining fabric. So now we have our exterior piece and our lining piece ready to sew together. There's just one more optional step that I like to do. I take my lining piece and I'm just going to trim it by 1/8 of an inch just on the bottom side. So this isn't in the instructions, but I think it is really helpful in terms of making sure that the lining stays on the inside and you can't see it from the front. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna do is take my two pieces, right sides together. I'm gonna make sure that they line up right along the center seam here and pin them in place. Okay, so now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and stitch with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance along this long edge here and this curved edge here at the top. So now that this is stitched together, I'm going to come in along this curved edge and cut in some more V's like we did along the center seam. Just be careful not to cut through your stitching. Now I'm going to turn this out so that it is right side out. Now what we're going to do is press this with the iron. So I'm going to start by doing this top edge. I'm going to iron this flat. It can be kind of tricky. You just want to kind of roll these two pieces of fabric between your fingers until you get that seam right along the edge, and then come in with your iron. This piece that sticks out here, you're going to iron that as well. And I'm just going to use my stitching as a guide as where to fold that. The lining should be slightly on the inside so that you don't see it from the outside. And we're going to do the same thing along the bottom edge. So the next step is also an optional step that's not in the pattern instructions. I like to come along this top edge here and this bottom edge here and just top stitch, just edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. So if you have your edge stitch foot, this would be a really great time to use it. I'm going to assume that you don't, and I'll show you how to just kind of eyeball it. So I'm just going to place the edge of my fabric so that it's about 1/8 of an inch away from where my needle is coming down. And I'm going to back stitch as usual and just go really slow, especially along this curved edge. When you get to this curve here, you can use your hand wheel, or you can do little pivots with your needle down. So as you can see, I've just top stitched that top side, and I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom edge. If you do have an edge stitch foot, which looks a little bit like this, you can use that. I'll show you how to do that for the bottom edge. So you just adjust this little wheel here until this white line is lined up with the 1/8 mark on your machine. And then I just line up the edge of my fabric with the edge of this plastic white piece on the edge stitch foot. The next thing that we're going to do is turn over these short edges. The pattern says 1/2 centimeter. That is a really small amount. It's somewhere right in between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. So let me show you on my seam gauge. It is right about there, you see. So it's really little. I'm just gonna turn that over, kind of press it, finger press it, and then come in with my iron to press that in place. So now I'm going to fold it one more time. The pattern says 2 centimeters. That is equivalent to 3/4 of an inch. It's about where this lining piece ends. So you're just going to fold it right there. Now I'm going to come along this edge here and just edge stitch this in place along both sides, creating a channel. If you are planning on using a hair tie or something that is already a loop, you want to place it in here now before you stitch this closed. Otherwise, we can always thread it through afterwards if you're using like a string or a tie or something. I'm going to switch back to my regular foot, although you could continue using your edge stitching foot if you have it. I'm just going to make sure that my needle is close to the edge here and then stitch all the way down this channel. Of course, you want to back stitch at the beginning and end. Okay, so we have our strips. If you cut out one long piece, if you had enough fabric to do that, then you don't need to piece it together, but I'm going to do that. So I've got 3 pieces to piece together. So I'm just going to sew them together, creating 2 seams. So I have one long piece. And I'm just going to stitch this together at 3/8 of an inch. So now I have one long strip, which should be 1.5 yards. So I'm going to trim down this seam allowance here. I don't need quite so much, so I'm just going to cut it in half. So the next thing I'm going to do is press these seams open. That'll also help reduce the bulk. The next thing we're going to do is fold this in half lengthwise, like this, so that the pretty side of the fabric is on the outside. So now it's all folded in half. The next step, I'm going to unfold it. I'm going to take this top edge and fold it down to meet at the fold line. And then this bottom edge will meet at the fold line as well. So they meet in the center. And then I'm going to press it all the way along the length of the strip. I'm going to fold it in half again like this, and then I'm going to press it again all the way along the length. So if you want to finish the edges here, I'll show you how to do that. You're going to take it, unfold it, and turn it right sides together like this, and then just pin that together. And we're going to stitch at 3/8 of an inch along this short edge. This can be kind of tricky, so if you're not comfortable doing this step, you can skip it. So I'm just gonna stitch this short edge here at 3/8 of an inch. Then I'm gonna trim down and turn it right side out and try to tuck the folded part back inside. So it should look like that once you tuck it back in there. So I'll do that one more time with the other side. Now what I'm going to do is stitch all the way along this open edge, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. A lot of times this end is really bulky, so what I like to do is put my needle down through it. It's pierced through the needle. I lift up my presser foot. Then I'm just going to come in and use a scrap of fabric that I've folded up, and I'm going to place that behind what I'm sewing underneath the presser foot. That'll help level it out. And I'm also going to hold on to these thread tails. That should be really helpful in getting us started. So I'm just going to gently kind of pull on the thread tails until it gets going. I need to backstitch. Again, if you have your edge stitch foot, you can use it here. It's a little bit hard to backstitch again because of the bulk here. So I'm just going to use that same trick again to level out my foot and then sew right off the edge. So now our mask is sewn and our tie is done. So cut off any extra threads you might have that are hanging off of here. What I'm going to do is take a safety pin, pierce one end. I'm going to go up through the bottom here, go around through the top, and then come out through the bottom with just this side. So I just use the safety pin to work my way through this casing. You could also do elastic here. So that's what this one is here. I've just used elastic. So the last thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to add a little case here, which has a little place to put some shaping wire in. So now I'm going to cut the piece for the nose wire. I'm going to mark a rectangle that is 4 inches long by 1¼ inches wide. Then I'll just cut that out with my scissors or a rotary cutter. So I'm at the iron. I'm just going to fold this side down by about 1/4 of an inch on both of the short sides. So now I'm going to fold this down by 3/8 of an inch, about 1 centimeter. And then I'll fold this piece up by about the same amount. I'm going to pin it to the wrong side, the lining side, just right about where you want your nose bridge to be. Now I'm going to stitch along the long edges and one short edge, and I'm going to leave one short edge unsewn. When I get close to the end, I'm going to put my needle down, pivot my fabric, and sew down this short side. I'm going to stitch back up it and down it again to reinforce. Then I'm going to pivot again and sew down this long edge, stopping when I get to the end here. Now I have my casing sewn on 3 sides with one end open. I have a piece of plastic covered wire that I'm going to use. So I'm going to just, with my needle still down, I'm just going to work this piece of plastic into this casing. And I want it to be a little shorter than this casing so I don't accidentally stitch over it when I close this up. If you are working with something that might rust, like a pipe cleaner covered in duct tape, or something else that you're not too sure about, leave one edge unsewn. That way you can take it out when you wash. Otherwise, I'm going to stitch this short edge closed. Remember to stitch it, backstitch it, stitch it again. I just want to make sure it's really stitched nice and closed. Okay, so now the mask is done. As you can see, the nose wire is in there, so you can mold it against your nose. I'm just going to show you how to put on the mask. So pretty basic. I'm just going to slip it on over my head. You can bunch it up on the sides to fit your face, pinch the nose bridge, and then tie it in the back. If you're using elastic, you can try it on, tie it, and then cut off the extra. So I hope this was helpful to you and you get out there and make your own mask.